And let me now invite to the stage. Let me just tell you who we've got. We're going to have Richard Vague right now. Then we have Senator Mark Warner. Then we have Jacob Hellberg, who is the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. And then we're going to wrap up before the crafted cocktails that we're having, which I hear are pretty good. Somebody's got to give me the names of them. I think one of them is called Bull Market and something else. But and then we've got Ambassador Jameson Greer, a friend for a long time, who is the U.S. Trade Representative. But without further ado, let me introduce Richard Vague. Richard, come on up. And this is going to be like 10 minutes, right? Okay. Richard, good to see you. Richard happens to be the president of Whitehall, but that's not why he's up here. Richard is a Renaissance man. He's written a lot of books. As I mentioned earlier in the day, he wrote the book, The Paradox of Debt. He's written the Illustrated Business History of the United States, which is one of the most beautiful books of all the kind of engravings and art of just kind of American business. Long time. I love it. You should buy it for Christmas. This is near Christmas time. But Richard was also the CEO of First USA Bank, which was one of the great popularizers of airline points, hotel points. If you remember First USA, they did. I was a great Yahoo Visa card guy, and I had points for everything that he was doing. That became Chase. He did the same thing as CEO of Juniper Financial, which became the backbone of Barclays credit cards. And so this is a guy who knows debt and issues. And now he doesn't have to do all that stuff anymore. But he has written a fascinating book about Thomas Willing. And I wanted to talk about Thomas Willing, who you called America's first major banking genius, right?
He was America's first banker, period.
First banker, period.
And he was America's first central banker.
And so why don't any of us know who he was?
Well,
which I know you're trying to change. Your book comes out in February and all this, so.
You know, historians kind of gloss over the subject of finance. Thomas Willing was the first banker in the United States. The first bank was created to help finance the American Revolution. Interestingly, President John Adams, said that Thomas Willing governed George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. He was that important.
Which made John Adams just love him, right?
Which John Adams was one of his enemies.
These founding fathers were so petty.
He viewed Willing and his crowd as America's first aristocracy. And he worried that the rise of American aristocracy was just going to replace the British aristocracy that they'd just gotten rid of.
Was he right?
Well, in some respects, these folks were extremely powerful and extremely wealthy, and his very comment about his influence over Washington and Hamilton, I think, is evidence of that.
So one of the things is, I have had the pleasure of going around with Richard and his wife in a horse-drawn carriage in Old Philadelphia, and you showed me who lived where. Hamilton lived here, Thomas Willing lived there. Tell us about the neighborhood.
There was a two-block stretch in Philadelphia that no one recognizes that was the most important two-block stretch in early American history. It's on 3rd Street from Spruce to Walnut to Chestnut. And George Washington lived there right after Yorktown. Willing lived there. Across the street from Willing is where Alexander Hamilton lived. William Bingham, who was...
Is that where he had his affair?
He had his affair with the
Maria Reynolds affair?
Maria Reynolds there. There were a couple of bawdy houses in the neighborhood too, by the way. And across Walnut, you had the two most important institutions in the United States, Hamilton's Treasury and Thomas Willing's Bank of the United States. And they were side by side. So you had Oliver Wolcott, you had Benjamin Chew, the Supreme Court Justice, you had the James Wilson, who was genuinely the father of the Constitution. It was power-packed two-block stretch, and there's barely a notice of it at this point.
And you're trying to fix that?
Well, I think it's an important story to tell because a lot went on in Willing's life that I think has profound influence. I think one of the reasons that Thomas Willing is not remembered is a very dramatic moment when he voted against the Declaration of Independence. And at first I viewed that as an anomaly, but Pennsylvania's government forbid its delegates for voting for the Declaration of Independence. So it was kind of a structural, institutional thing that was true at that moment. And it took a very vitriolic, acidic, virtual civil war within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to overturn that aristocracy and end up vote for the Declaration of Independence. And the division was the bankers who are of English heritage that lived in the coastal cities like Philadelphia versus the renegade Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who'd been pouring into the country and were farmers and artisans in Western Pennsylvania. They were Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, and that was the war that was going on. And if those renegade Scotch-Irish Presbyterians had not prevailed, we wouldn't have had the vote for the Declaration of Independence on July the 2nd, by the way. In fact, there were two votes, July the 1st and July the 2nd.
I think a lot of people watching on live C-SPAN right now might say, okay, nice to hear all this history, but why does it matter today? And so I'm, and I got to say in this audience, and I see my friend Tristan Schucraft, I see other CEOs, we've got Aaron Dowd here who's in critical materials. We've got a lot of folks that are, in the business environment, scrambling to make this economy work. So how do we take those early lessons of those petty founding fathers, the battles over finance, property rights, and all of that, early forging of, the social contract and norms between government and business? And so why is your book, relevant today?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One of them is the very paradigm that I described, coastal elites versus middle and lower income individuals in the interior of the country, I argue was fully present in 1776 and is the same paradigm we have in the United States today. So I think
say that again, the who and the who?
The coastal elites versus the interior middle class was the clash that happened in 1776. I think it's basically the same paradigm we have today. And I think it's instructive. And by the way, the apotheosis of that middle-class Scotch-Irish Presbyterian faction was a couple of decades later in the form of Andrew Jackson. Mm. So, it's a very well-established and very important paradigm in American history. The other important thing about Thomas Willing was he was the predominant banker for 30 years. First, as the first banker, and then as the first central banker in the Bank of the United States. The country Washington took the presidency position in 1789. The first financial crisis in American history was 1791, less than 2 years later. The second financial crisis in American history was 1792. The third financial crisis in American history was 1796. And by the way, they are exactly the paradigm we still have today, which was folks got too excited, there was too much enthusiasm, prices went far too high, whether they were prices of U.S. securities, Bank of the United States stock, or land itself. So you had these massive run-ups in prices, and then you had a massive...
So are you shorting AI stocks?
Well, let me tell you, the paradigm of American business was established at the very inception of this country. And by the way, all those crises happened at a period that Willing presided over in which U.S. GDP tripled and in which massive innovation occurred in manufacturing, in road construction, in canal construction. The stock market was established. One of these crises brought into being the New York Stock Exchange as a way to try to prevent future crashes. So I think all of what we think of as America was fully present in that very robust first decade.
I mean, a nasty part of that time, though, was, because I read part of your book and also looked at it, was, the slave industry and the slave trade was also very much part of the balance sheets of those businesses, even of the coastal elites.
The book I'm writing right now, by the way, is the establishment of the Bank of England. About a century prior to that, there was a massive slave industry that was integral to the triangular trade of the time. Philly had a little bit of that, and Thomas Willing participated in a little of that, and the only reason was the crops of Pennsylvania, which were wheat primarily and corn, didn't require nearly as much labor as a tobacco crop or a rice crop or an indigo crop which were the further southern. So he has that stain on his record, but all of Pennsylvania did, but just not nearly to the degree that it happened further south.
Was Alexander Hamilton really a big deal?
Alexander Hamilton was a big deal, and Thomas Willing and Alexander Hamilton worked hand in glove. And in fact, the first transaction between the two was when Alexander Hamilton was 16 years old, working, he was precocious, genius, who was already practically running his boss's trading firm in St. Croix, and they were trading wheat and flour. Thomas Willing was in Philadelphia, had the largest merchant trading business in North America, and there's a letter of correspondence between Willing and Alexander Hamilton. They really developed the system of the U.S. financial system together because the United States government and Alexander Hamilton borrowed from Thomas Willing to make payroll. As soon as the government started, Alexander Hamilton walked down with his friends at the Bank of New York and then walked over to Thomas Willing and borrowed about $80,000 to make payroll and to begin to pay the expenses of the United States government. So Thomas Willing was America's banker.
When you kind of look at that, that timing, we've got Mark Warner coming up here, and we've had today really fascinating way. The one thing I'll say that I'm really proud of today is that we've had, folks like Senator Dave McCormick, we've had Chris Coons, we've had Mark Warner, we had 3 different chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, people that have been inside the Trump administration, people who are Democratic, opposition. You sort of see that there is some overlap, some difference. We've had debate today. But I think when it comes to sort of thinking about the future, I really am interested in crypto. I am interested in AI and what it's going to do. And you just sort of feel like the texture of the American economy is at a point where we're going to see a lot of change and difference. But I guess my question, which I don't mean to be trite, is did it feel that way at the beginning?
It was massive change at the beginning. And you bring up crypto, so I think it's worth noting. And this is, I think, a very important fact about the American financial system, is in 1789, there was no United States currency.
So they were crypto-friendly early.
There were hundreds of different currencies. Every single financial institution issued its own currency. And by the way, one of the issues, if you issued your own currency, was getting folks to trust it, to getting merchants to accept it. There was no United States currency until 1861. And so I'm one of the guys that welcomes.
We had no U.S. currency until 1861?
We had no U.S. currency until 1861. None. And really, it continued to be largely private until 1913, or really 1916, when the Federal Reserve began issuing notes. There were hundreds of different currencies. Merchants had to be able to negotiate and discount these hundreds of different securities. And that's, frankly, one of the services that the central bank provided, was a place to discount any kind of, if you got a note from Cincinnati, which was the extreme western part of the country at that point in time, you had no idea whether that bank was going to be good on that. One of the things the central bank and Thomas Willing did was to discount that and turn it into local currency for you.
Let me ask you a more contemporary question, because, a lot of our politics and, I would argue a lot of our politics today on both sides of the aisle came out of the shock and impact of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the subprime meltdown. You wrote a book and a paper around that time, and you were working with Barclays. I think you were at Barclays at that time, right? So in Juniper. And you warned everybody this was coming. I remember it. I've known you for a long time. You warned everybody this was coming. Tim Geithner's book on this says nobody could have seen this coming. And there were people out there like Sheila, but there were other people who said, hey, we beg to disagree. Clearly there were warning signs all over. But there was a certain class, a big-time economic policymakers who said there's no way anyone could see this coming. So I just want to put on the record you did. I remember seeing it. You've shamed a lot of them. It's probably impacted a lot of your friendships. But as you're sitting today and you're looking ahead, are there things that you see that worry you as bubbles ready to pop, or things that could be around the corner that you ought to think ought to be on people's radar screen?
It is only real estate crises that are large. Real estate's the largest sector of the economy that's not the government itself. And so only a real estate crisis is big enough to bring a country down to its knees. And that's what we had in '08. We don't have that. Real estate's in pretty good shape right now. We may have
an AI bubble crisis, no problem.
There's only, maybe $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion worth of debt. In '08, there was $10 trillion worth of mortgages, and probably half of those were bad. And by the way, it's easy to see financial crisis because it's all about the rate of change or growth in private sector debt. So you could look at that at any point in time and easily predict. The problem is the Fed doesn't incorporate private debt into its modeling of the economy, which is a fairly egregious omission. But
so final quick comment. You're such an expert on Thomas Willing and Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, who just seems so prissy and complicated. Sorry, John Adams fans. But, who were the biggest proponents of tariffs in that time?
Tariffs got introduced. First of all, the United States...
Don't go long form.
During the Revolution, Britain was trying to shut us off, so we argued for free trade. As we got a little bigger and started to do our own manufacturing, we immediately put in place tariffs to protect our nascent industries. The other thing we did was that we immediately organized the theft of intellectual property from England to seed our manufacturing. And we became the biggest proponent of tariffs for over a century until our manufacturing sector got so dominant that we didn't need tariffs anymore.
That is the perfect opener for Jamison Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative who's coming here. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Vague, president of Whitehall. Get his book, check it out, Thomas Willing, February.